Sergey.
Deming, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you? I see Vlad just got here too. How's it going, Vlad?
Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good.
Good.
How are you guys?
Hanging in there. That long weekend, was appreciated. And you guys are both past your assessments. Nice. I'm very excited for this week to be over so everyone can take a breath. I'm going to go ahead and just ping everybody else real fast. Okay, so where are you guys at? I think Vlad, you might be on pace or a little bit ahead, and then Sergey, are you in the SQL stuff now?
I'm a little bit behind. I started yesterday when I started new block, object relationship over there.
Gotcha. And that's not a bad thing to have a blog post about, right? Because object relationships are not going away.
Yeah.
All right. So John is with us. How's it going, John? I don't think he can hear me yet.
Block due dates, those aren't correct, right?
No, I don't know why they still exist. They were a feature of the self-paced program.
Yeah.
I think the idea was to inject some shame so people would do their blog posts within a timely fashion. But they don't mean anything for us. You can ignore them. The only blog post due dates that matter are that the first mile one that you did, and then you have to do a blog for each project, but then you need one more before you graduate.
Okay.
So technically, by the time your final project is due, but you might as well just do one earlier on something else that's code related. All right, how are you, John?
I'm fine. A little stuck right now, but I have time. So.
Yeah, what lab are you on?
Twitter.
Twitter. Wow. Okay, so that's the big lab of this mod. So you're just about in project mode.
Yeah.
That's exciting. Oh man. You really went through that quickly. You should be impressed with yourself.
Yeah, we can have.
Yeah, and you did all the bonus stuff too.
No, I didn't do the last two bonuses.
Gotcha. Okay. So you're still a mere mortal, not a superhuman. Yep. Hey Dina, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing good. How are you guys?
Hanging in there.
There I am.
Dina's assessment is tomorrow. Are you guys excited for her? Hey, Abdul. Abdul is lurking with his perfect headshot. He's muted if he's responding to me. Hello. Hey, how are you?
Doing good. How are you?
Doing well. Where are you at in the curriculum?
I'm sorry. Let me go back and look. User authentication in Sinatra.
Cool stuff. All right, yeah. So a bit ahead. So this will be nice. This is a nice mix. Some of you haven't seen any of what we'll talk about today. Some of you are way ahead, so this will be a nice review. Some of you are right in that sweet spot, and all that is good because more looking at code and talking about it is never going to hurt. Right? So today, let me go ahead and share my screen, lest I forget. Right? Wait. Share. Don't leave. There we go. Cool. So today we're going to be building an ORM from scratch, right? And really what I've tried to stress to you guys is that this section is really just trying to teach you what's under the hood of an ORM, or an object relational mapper, right? So it's just underscoring what they can do for us. It's not a prescription for code you need to write every time you build an application, right? It's just giving you a sense of what's under the hood. Right? So what we'll stress is that ORMs, they're basically using metaprogramming to build a ton of stuff for you, right? Everything that your models need to work, everything that you need to create objects, it's building that for you and letting you connect or map rows in your database to your Ruby objects, which is really powerful. Now, for those of you who are in this section, you might find that it seems a little complicated, but again, it's teaching you what's under the hood of a really powerful tool, right? It's not something that you have to memorize, but it's something you should appreciate and have a sense of why it's useful, right? So we're showing you what active record ultimately is going to do for us in this mod when we get to Sinatra, and then in next mod and moving forward when we get to Rails, because both of those frameworks use active record. And Rails is never really going to go away for us. Even in your final project, your back end is going to be in Rails, right? So what's active record going to do for you? It's going to build all your adder accessors for you. It's going to build initialize for you. It's going to build your class constructors, your class finders, your find by ID or what have you. It's going to build your all method for you. So a lot of this code we've been writing out manually, we're not going to have to do that anymore because active record will build it for us, right? So eventually we'll get to the point, this is going to be, oh, I thought I had a replit. Hold up. I just need any old replit to work in. Not this guy. I just feel like it's a little easier if I have a visual. So eventually we're going to get to the point where your models themselves are like stupidly simple. They don't really have anything going on. You can build something like a dog class, a class called dog, and all you have to do is add this one simple bit of code where your code inherits from something called active record base. And just by doing that, right, active record is going to teach your model to do all this code that we're going to write today, right? So that itself is really powerful, right? So anything that active record knows how to do, right, it's going to teach your model about in a way that's really powerful, right? So you'll be able to do something like build 3 or 4 dog instances. So call your dog.new. You can look at dog.all and get back all of your instances without ever having to write an all method or an all class variable, anything like that, without having to define your own initialize, right? Active record is going to do that for you. And then when you call dog.all, which you didn't have to define yourself, right? Active record is going to ping your database. It's going to pull all of that row data for your objects. It's going to make objects from them, like put them in a new array and give those back to you without you having had to write much code at all, right? Any questions about that piece? Because it's really that like this is functionality we're going to use all the time, but we're moving into a space where we're not going to have to write it out manually for very much longer. Cool, right? So basically like this section of the module we're on right now is like, if you didn't have active record, right? How would you build an ORM from scratch? How would you build that out yourself manually? And really it's just a very simplified version. Active record itself is massive, right? I don't think anybody knows everything about active record and what it can offer us unless you're like a dev for their team, right? But as long as you're in this program, you're going to have to probably be looking at that documentation, right? Although things that we use commonly, they'll become like pretty internalized like anything else, right? But it's super powerful. One thing I wanted to stress, if there's no other study group you guys go to, like for active record besides this one, in a couple weeks, there's a study group we'll have called Active Record Associations, right? It's all about relationships, right? So what we'll see is that we no longer have to manually write out our object relationships like we did in mod 1 that some of you guys were traumatized by, your has many and your belongs to and your has many through, right? Now we'll be able to use macros that are built by active record. So we won't have to do that manually, but what active record is going to do is it's going to build a ton of methods for us based on those macros that we built, right? I think when I was a student, and actually many students, when they get to that point in the curriculum, right, you kind of get a bunch of methods that are thrown at you and you don't get an appreciation for them until later. So one thing I'm going to try to underscore is that like object relationships, especially in active record, it's really powerful. It's a lot to internalize. So I'm going to try to build that into you guys early on. Okay, so to beat a dead horse, our ORM is our object relational mapper. It maps our rows and our tables to objects in our Ruby program and lets us use simple Ruby methods to like manipulate that data. All right, into the good stuff. So what do I have here? I've got a very simple application that lets me make tweets, right? John kind of led me into this earlier, but at the end of this module, like the big lab that you guys have looming for you, is called Flitter, right? It's a souped up version of what I have here, right? It's basically the music library lab of mod 2, right? So every mod is going to have one or two kind of like big impending labs that take a little longer. So just try to build some wiggle room for yourselves in the program. Try to stay ahead. Ahead is the best. Like on pace is second best, right? So do that if you can. But in any case, what do I have here? I've got actually one thing here. There we go. I'm still getting a handle on VS Code. So I've got a tweet class here. I've got some simple outer accessors. A tweet has a message. It's got a username. I've got a class variable called all. I've got a pretty simple initialize method that takes in a hash of attributes and it sets a message and a username from those, right? Got an all reader. I've got a save method. All of this is pretty standard, and at this point, it's kind of old-fashioned, right? So our goal for today is to start moving this code into the future with our ORM. Cool. Right. I've got another file here called tweets app. This is pretty, let me actually move you into my second screen. There we go. Okay. So this is analogous to your CLI for your CLI projects, right? So you've got a method called call that runs your program. It's running a pretty simple loop here. It's actually an infinite loop because true is always true. But all it does is it greets my user. It asks for a username and gets it. It asks for a message and gets it. And then what does it do? It makes a new tweet instance from a hash of attributes and then saves it, grabs all my tweets for me, and then it renders them in this kind of helper method I have here that loops through all my tweets and kind of puts each one out individually, right? So relatively simple, and that should be pretty palatable for you guys having gone through the CLI project, this general structure here. Now, okay, this is one thing. So one pattern that we're gonna get into that might seem a little odd at first is that we'll often get into this pattern of making a new instance and then saving it rather than condensing that into one step. You guys have seen in like those class method labs, you have a method called create that's available to you that handles saving for you. An active record will have that for us too. But we'll see that it's much more common to like make objects, then potentially do something with them, like maybe we update them or maybe we run validations, right? So checking that that data looks the way that we want, and then we save it, right? Because what we're gonna see moving forward is that our database is the source of all truth, and you don't wanna let data get into your database willy-nilly, right? You wanna make sure that that data is good. It's a lot easier to validate it and then enter it into your database than to correct it. A simple use case would be like letting a user sign up to your application. You wouldn't want them to sign up without a username or without a password or with like an insecure password, right? So you might make a new instance, but then check that it's structured right and then save it. So it's just a more common pattern of like this two-step, make it, then save it. Cool. Okay. So now I've got this simple application. I do actually have a database. I'm not making, well, it doesn't really look like anything, but I do have that file that exists. I'm just not using it at all. So what happens is I can run my program, right? It's just a bin file. It will do what I ask it to. I'm not very creative at these things. I'm gonna say Carol. Oh, what? I'm gonna mess this up. Cool. And kittens. I don't know how many of you have seen Tiger King, and you'll appreciate this reference. I did not intend to hit a pry yet. I'm gonna queue and then enter, right? It will display that tweet. I'm gonna add something else. I've run out of cool pop culture references, so we're gonna just call my name here. Sup. See, I haven't figured out a way to like delete it. That doesn't seem to work. But if I hit enter, I get There we go, right? So I get the first one, I get the second one, I could add another one. Right, I can hit exit and I see that they're all displayed, right? But then if I go ahead and I exit my program rather ungracefully there, I'm gonna get that pry out while I remember. I guess I just have to save. So if I spin up my program again, right, if I make a new username, let's say, Abdul, give me a message.
Carol Baskin's fault.
Carol Baskin's fault. Oh no, we're gonna pretend that says what we want. Baskin's fault, right? So I only get back that first tweet. Nothing has persisted, right? So this is basically the state of your CLI projects, right? Every single time you ran your bin file, you had to go out and scrape your website again, or you had to go out and hit your API again, because nothing ever persisted, right? So you had to do that work. So one thing we're trying to do here is not have to repeat that process, right? We want to be able to save our data to a database. That's called persistence. We can persist our data. Cool. Yeah, so we're like headed into this awesome world where we have a SQLite database, and from one time to the next, when we run our program, it will remember data that we've already gotten. Okay, so then I do have a DB running here, right? Doesn't have any data currently, right? But I've got a pretty simple table. I've got a table that keeps track of tweets, and then they have some attributes, some columns here, right? I've got an ID for my primary key, right? It's an integer. I've got a username that's text and a message that's also text, right? So now our job is like, how do we connect our program to this database, right? And if we look in our bin file here, right? So again, really similar to your CLI project, right? I've got my shebang, I'm requiring my environment, I'm making a new instance of that tweets app class that I have, and I'm running an instance method on it that runs my program, right? But before that, I'm requiring this environment. So if I look there, right, I'm doing a few different things. I'm requiring bundler because it helps me install my dependencies, but I've got kind of this funky bit of code here that does something in particular, right? All it does is it makes a constant, because a constant is global. I can access it elsewhere in my program. We can call it DB, that's convention, or we can call it database. It really doesn't matter, it's arbitrary, right? But all I'm doing is I'm telling it to point to a hash that's got a single key value pair, right? Now this key is arbitrary. It's pretty common to call it something like con or connection, right? It doesn't matter. I could call it banana and the code would still work the same, right? We're just using properties of hashes, right? But what it does is it's pointing to an instance of this database class that I have access to with SQLite, right? If I look at my gem file, I've required this gem called SQLite 3, right? And because I have done that, I have access to that class. So I'm making a new instance of it, and I'm telling it where to live in my program. I'm saying, hey, in a DB folder, create this database file called twitter.db. Right? Now, I think I can do this, right? So what that's going to do is it just gives me access to an instance of a DB, which we looked at, I think, in our second to last study group. So if I look at DB here, it's just an object, right? It has methods. I can ask it about its methods. Some of these we're going to use fairly frequently. It might have more than I'm willing to sift through. Some of the common ones we'll use are execute, and you'll see here, I've called a method called results as hash, which basically is saying like when you return information from my database, rather than the default of like giving me an array of arrays, give me an array of hashes. So I'm just specifying I want those results as a hash, right? But again, all of this is arbitrary. I think this will work. I'm gonna feel a little silly if this doesn't work. But I think sometimes the curriculum doesn't do always an amazing job of demystifying how things work. So you get a sense of like certain things like being important just for how they're written. Whereas a lot of this is actually arbitrary. I could call this apple, it's still a constant. I could call this banana, it's still just a key. If I run this code, right? If I do apple, that's my constant, right? And I access a key called banana, it still works just the same. So there's nothing special about those words. It's just convention. We're just using properties of hashes. I'm going to change that before I forget. Any questions about that piece? No, we're good. And then I just require some other stuff for my program. Nothing too crazy there. But again, all that's doing is letting me access anywhere in my program that instance of my database, right? Just using this convention, right? So, and then if I look in my run file here, I think this I already hit on, right? We're making a new instance, we're calling our method. That's what takes us into our program, right? The actual method that runs our program is in Tweets app. That's nothing too crazy. That gets me into my tweets. Now, the only issue I have now that is what ultimately we want to fix is that we're sort of saving, right? We have a method that we've defined that's called save. It does something, right? It just doesn't actually interact with my database at all. We're still using kind of this now outdated pattern where we're using this class variable, right? And by the end of today, like we're not going to use any of this, right? We're going to get rid of it. I think this I'll leave in for now so I don't break other things. So then how do I update this all method so that I actually am using data from my tables? Right? The first question I would ask is how do I even access my database here at this point in my program, given what we were just talking about?
Couldn't you use the constant that we just used?
Yeah, exactly, right? Perfect. Thanks, Dina. That's why I defined it, right? Because it's a constant and I can access it, right? So I can access my actual database instance using this convention, right? And then I'm going to call a pretty common method called execute on it, which lets me pass SQL statements, right, to that database, right? So then it becomes just a question of what is the SQL that I write that says, hey, go into my table and get me all of my tweets. Which some of you should be dreaming about SQL at this point. It should be old hat, some of this simple stuff. So how do I ask my program to give me all of my tweets?
You do a select statement like select asterisk tweets.
Cool. Close. What are we missing?
Sorry, select from tweets.
Right. So we still want everything, but we have to specify our table. But that's exactly right. So all I'm doing is I'm passing a SQL statement to my database, and that can be executed for me. Right. Now, quick question. What would the return value of this statement be? Anybody know? Anybody who's done those labs, have you seen?
Would it be every instance of it? Or
Oh, so, well, yes and no. So, so the one thing is that our database does not return instances. It returns data that we then map to instances in our program, right? So we use our objects to actually visualize data in the database. What it will return is an array, specifically of hashes, because I specified, give me your results as hashes. So every entry for a tweet is going to come back as a hash. And then if there are multiple results, I should get them back as an array. So an array of hashes. So then we could easily test this out. I'm going to store this in a variable and add a binding here. But then I have one problem in that I currently do not have anything in my database, right? It's empty, no dice. So just for right now, until we implement that, we're going to need some SQL here. Right? I see some of you have joined us. I see Matt's here. I see Sarah. I see Broderick. Nice to see you guys. We're going to add some insert statements How do I insert an entry into my database? How do I do it? Given how my database is structured, how my tables are, right?
Sort them too.
Cool, we're gonna need, where did I go? There we go. So we can execute SQL right here in DB browser. So
Into tweets,
right, so the name of my table.
values.
Not quite yet. First we have to specify the columns, right?
Oh, yeah.
So here, I think it is username and message. Except that you spell it right. Then values. What are the specific values? And then I'm not very creative. Somebody give me a username. Otherwise, I'm going to start naming things after my cats.
Leroy Jenkins.
Very specific. Okay, and then what is his message, Abdul?
It's from a meme. I remember. Oh, he screams his own name. But we can put something else.
I don't know. I don't know if I want to know. Okay, so that's one, and then I'll get uncreative for these other guys. I've got a cat named Max. Meow. I've got a cat named Zeus. And he's derpy, so he'll say derp. Right? So just some dummy data, but then if I go ahead and I execute that, right? So with this play button here, right? That should be executed into my database. If I look at my data, I've got a few objects here, right? So now I've at least got something in my database. And now I think the one thing I have to do, so let me make sure. So one thing I had to find out the hard way that some of you guys might run into if you use something like DB browser, or if you use something like Base, is that making changes in your database visualizer doesn't inherently change your project database and vice versa. So one thing you have to do is you have to click this option here, write changes. It's going to save the changes that you made. Otherwise, you're going to feel very silly like me when I got an error that was strange and I Googled it and it was basically like, you have to save your database. So you just have to make sure to write those changes. But now if I run my code here, I'm going to get out of that binding. I have to remember to get rid of that. We're going to make a new tweet just for argument's sake. Let's call it something like test. But now, oh, I brought this upon myself. So that was probably because I went a little willy-nilly in this class here. Yeah, because I got rid of this. We will get rid of it, but just not yet. So now if I run this, test, right? So now if I look at my results, right, I get back what? I get back an array specifically of hashes because I told it to give my results back to me as a hash, right? But those things persist, the 3 that I had in my database, right? Any questions about that piece before we move forward? You're like 80% with me. Can you thumbs up me? Cool. I got a smile out of some of you. I'll take that. Okay, cool. So now the problem is that ultimately I do not want hashes, right? So this is a good point because the database, it doesn't give us objects. It's going to give us arrays as a default. It's going to give us hashes if we specify that, right? If we want to turn that into objects that we then use in our Ruby program, we have to like tell our program how to do that. So then the question becomes, how do I take this array of hashes and then tell my program to make objects out of those hashes? Where do I even start? So I've got an array of things. I want to do some repeated thing for every item in my array, like make a new tweet out of them.
You could use meta programming.
I suppose that you could use meta programming. You still have to iterate at some point though, which is what I'm getting at, right? So like, because we're working with an array of hashes, we're not going to do this with meta programming. I don't know if I have the bandwidth for it. I'll probably get it wrong, but we're going to do it in a more palatable way for right now, right? We're going to take our array, we're going to iterate over it, right? I'm going to use map because I care about what this method returns, right? If I use something like each, it's going to return like the same results array no matter what. Right? I'm going to be very explicit in what I call this so I don't confuse myself. Each of these is a hash that represents a tweet, right? So that's nothing too bad, right? I'm just looping through arrays, right? But then what do I want to do with each of those hashes? I want to make a new tweet. And conveniently for me, my initialize knows how to handle hashes, right? So all I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, initialize a new tweet, right? And pass it that tweet hash. Not that. Right? So that's not too bad. What I'm going to do, just because I'm going to be poking around here in Pry, is I'm just going to store this in a variable. Cool. And maybe return that too. I guess I don't really need to. But. Now, I have a problem here. Can anyone anticipate a problem with this method and how I'm trying to make these tweets? There's a disconnect between how I'm making my objects and what actually lives in my database.
You're not like verifying the type it might be? Well, does that matter?
I don't think it should matter here. Well, I guess I see what you're getting at. Like
Like if it was an integer, you don't want to put a string, but messages and username are both text.
Yeah, so we specified that in our database. But that's kind of leading us to something. Like when I pull data from my database, what attributes do I get back? Do I just get username and message?
And you get the ID.
I get the ID, which I haven't told my model how to handle, right? So like when I pull that data, I mean, there's going to be an ID in there because like when we save our data to a database, it gets an ID. I just haven't accounted for that in my model, right? So what I need to do is tell my model how to handle getting and setting an ID on an object, and then doing the same here, actually setting that property.
Verdomme.
Sorry?
Sorry.
No worries. Is everybody good? Does anybody have questions? No. So then now we should be good. And in theory, oh, I don't have to exit. But if I run this now, and then unfortunately I need a new one. But now if I look at my new results, right, I get lovely tweet objects, right? So the objects don't magically appear, like I have to create them from the data that I'm getting back from my database, right? But again, Active Record is going to do all this glorious work for us, right? So we get these beautiful objects. Good. Perfect. Got all that. Yeah, so now like I've got all my objects, I've mapped them to my tables, they come back as objects when I get that data as a nice lovely array that I can then use however I want in my application. And that's really powerful. No questions on that so far and how we've situated this? You guys are still alive over there, most of you? I don't hear, well, I guess you guys are muted, so I wouldn't hear snoring, but you all seem to still be alive, so that's all right. Okay, now, so I have the ability to save to, actually, I have the ability to get back existing tweets in my database, but I don't currently have saving functionality, right? I'm still kind of working on this old school pattern where I'm using that add all, and I don't want to do that anymore. I'm actually going to get rid of it now. So then if I wanted to actually add a new tweet to my database, right? How do I set that up here now that we're using this database paradigm? Where do I start?
You connect to the DB like you did with the self.all.
Perfect, right? So I need to connect to my database instance, right? And just like we did last time, we can execute some SQL on that instance, right? How do I want to do this? I could pass SQL directly here. When it gets a little long and clunky, I like to abstract it away. So I'm going to make a variable called SQL and then build my SQL in there, right? So just defining that SQL string. Right? How would I write the SQL to insert a new entry into my database?
With an insert statement?
Yeah, right? So I could say something like insert into tweet. Oh no, we're shouting all across the board. Right, and again, remember that the casing for SQL is it's arbitrary in that it will work any way you do it, but it's convention to put the actual SQL code as capitalized, but then things that are specific to our application tend to be downcased, right? So we're inserting into tweets, and then what comes next? Right?
The column list.
Parameters.
Yeah, the name of my columns, right? So username and then message,
And ID.
right?
Oh wait, no, you wouldn't.
Oh, that's a good question. Do I need to insert an ID into my database?
No, the database will do that.
Right. So not only do I not need to, I shouldn't do it, right? Because the idea is when you save an entry into your table, that primary key gets auto incremented, right? So it will be set. It's done by your database, and that's important so that it's unique, right? That's a great question. So I don't have to do that. I do need to specify that I'm giving values. And then how do I go about adding these values here? There's kind of like the way that we did it in DB browser, but there's a newer pattern that you guys learn in later labs. So you're not manually putting your values into values here, right?
Question mark.
Yeah, so you can use these placeholders. Thanks, John. And then specify later what you want those values to be, right? Have many of you seen that pattern so far? I was trying to find where exactly they teach it to you in the section, but I couldn't quite, but you guys have seen it, right? So again, these are just placeholder values. And the idea is that with this execute method here, you can pass it multiple arguments. The first is going to be your SQL string, but then you can pass it whatever placeholder values you need, like what actually needs to get inputted there, right, in the order that you need them. Right? So then my next question would be is if I want to insert this entry into my database and I know I need to input a username and a message, how do I access those values? Where do they come from? So what kind of method is this?
Instance.
It's an instance method. What do I have access to in every instance method?
The instance.
That's true.
Self.
Okay.
No, you're good. It's more like a gotcha for me because I'm like, I thought that question was brilliant, but there was wiggle room. So it's asking better questions is a thing I'm learning over time. But yeah, you have access to the current instance via self. So I can say, hey, this current object that I have whose data is not yet in my database, let me grab its message, right? I'm going to input that when I do this, when I execute my SQL statement. And then the same thing, oops, we need to follow the order though. Username, and then dot message, right? So we're just passing it there, right? That part makes sense. And we already got at my next point, which was like, why is the ID not here? Because your instance doesn't get an ID until it's saved. So you don't have to manually input that. But what I should be able to do, I think I can do it in this method. Sometimes funky things happen when you put the binding in the method that you're like then calling. So if I exit my program, so I'm here now. If where do I want to be? Oh, I probably don't want to be in this method, huh? We could at least see what it returns. I think it just is going to return an empty an array. Yeah, but if I look at tweet.all and end up here, dang it. Not what I meant to do. Test will end up here. Then we can exit. Then we can do tweet dot all, but then it's gonna take me back here. We'll get this. There we go. We get our tweet objects. We get this last one. Will it save? Which we managed to do. I think it's because I exited through and I tried it again. So I ended up with a duplicate. But then we ended up with this last one here too that we just tried. So a little funkiness because of where I've got my prize, but it did end up in that array. Now, one thing that's also a little confusing, if we look at our data here, oh, it did save, right? It's 6. Got it. Sometimes you have to reload this kind of like arrow button here. Sometimes you'll find that if you make changes in your program, it's not immediately reflected in your database. So you can reload it if that's the case. But in this case, we've got it here, the 2 that we tried before, and then the very last one, right? So it is persisting. Right. Cool. Right. And again, the power of this is like really crazy. Like all this code that we've written out here, right? Everything we have here, like soon we're going to get rid of and we'll be able to do with something as simple as inheriting from active record, right? So none of this will have to write out manually long term. We're just getting a sense of how it does work. So like going forward, we will set up our own databases, we'll set up our tables, we'll inherit from active record. It will know how to pull from our database, get the information we need. It'll know about our initialize method, our adder accessors. It'll know how to save for us, and also update our database, right? Which is pretty crazy. Okay. Now, what I want to do here, I'm going to move my binding into this other class that I have. What did I do? There we go. I'm going to choose to put it here. So if I run my program, not very creative, you guys will see. It's not, I'm not, what do they say, left-brained? No, I'm not left-brained so much. The rest of my family got that, not me so much. So one thing I want to show you. So I've got this tweet here. I'm already saving it. I have access to it as tweet because why? I should have access to it. Tweet.new. Okay, that was weird. Maybe it's because I needed to reload. I'm going to do that just to be safe, to do that reloading. Okay, so at least we see it here. So it did persist. What happens if I try to save this tweet again? If I take this single tweet, right, and I call .save, what will it do? Because I told it to do that.
Did you? Because you don't have an ID.
Sorry?
No, you don't have an ID. So did you save it?
Oh, that's a good question. So it does have an ID. So this is a good question. So this is making a new tweet, and I'm just pulling that tweet that I made. Yeah, so it's not actually pulling it from the database. It's saving it, but the actual tweet is just the object. So it doesn't have a database there, or an ID there rather. But I guess
But normally when you save it, that tweet new. Okay, yeah, no problem.
Let's see if I save it again. It would be better to actually. Right, our database is a source of truth, so I'm going to make a database call to actually go ahead and look. If I call all my tweets, if I look at the very last one, right, it would help if I didn't call everything the same thing, but it does get an ID, right? But my next point is that like there's nothing to stop me from saving this same tweet over and over again. And then if I ping my database, right, I've got a bunch of tweets that all have the same data. Right, they've all got that AA, but they do get IDs. They are being saved because I don't have any logic to prevent the same tweet from being saved again. Right? So then we want to think about, how do I teach my program to distinguish between, like, I don't want to give it all away, like how to save when it's supposed to versus how to do something different when that object has been saved before, right? So kind of the first thing I would ask is how do we know when the object has been saved before?
As ID.
It has an ID. So because this is an instance method and we have access to our attributes like via self, we have that object, I can say something like, hey, if this object has ever been saved before, if it has an ID, right, do some stuff, right? Don't save it, but do some other stuff that we'll describe in just a second, right? If it's got an ID, do something with it. Otherwise, if it has never been saved before, right, that self.id is going to be nil. Go ahead and execute the SQL that would actually save it to my database. Okay. So then it becomes like, what do we want to do if I have a tweet that has been saved before? I guess this is not a perfect example because here they're all the same, but like I might potentially want to edit a tweet, right? Like update it, right? Change the name of the user, change the name of the message. So if it has been saved before, presumably all I might ever want to do other than like delete it, which we'll handle later, is like update it. Oh, I see. You guys know I'm bad with the chat. I see your response in chat, Vlad. Thanks for letting me know. He's saying that the mapping Ruby classes to database tables is where they talk about using the question mark in your SQL. Okay, but here I'm going to follow a similar pattern. I still have to connect to my database object, right? I'm still going to execute some SQL. Okay, I'm going to pass that here for now. We're going to keep the pattern of having a separate string. How do I execute the SQL to like update an existing entry? This is the one that I always forget. So if I want to update an existing entry, you guys should have your SQL cheat sheets that I gave you guys a couple study groups back.
It's update.
Right, you can use update, perfect, right? So I can update and then I specify my table, update, tweets, and then what is it that I want to do?
Set.
Right, I want to set, and then here, this actually is a little bit funky. What do I get into next here?
Most likely the message.
Yeah. So let's assume I want the ability to update both if I want to update my username and my message. It's a little silly, but we're accounting for all cases here, right? But I might want to update both my username, right? And we're going to follow the pattern of passing in that placeholder, right? So I'm not going to give the actual value yet, but I might want to update the username and also potentially update the message. Right? Also going to give a placeholder. But then how do I know which row in my table that I should be updating?
Where ID is.
Right. So probably, I mean, in theory, we could use any attribute, but we know anything that's in our table has an ID and it's unique. Where ID is equal to, and that's going to be a specific value, but we can just use our placeholder for now, right? So I want to set my username and my message equal to whatever I may have edited them to, and I need to know where exactly in my database to be updating. Right? But then I need to pass whatever data I need so I can follow a similar pattern here, but I have everything I need. I can say, hey, pass in whatever the new or existing username is, pass in the probably updated message, and then how do I access my ID?
Self.id.
Perfect. Okay. There's a lot going on here. Any questions? Because I know where the lab where this comes up tends to be a sticking point. So if any of this doesn't make sense, holler at me now. in the sense of yelling questions at me, not like trying to pick me up on the street. No, we feel pretty good about it.
I guess
Yeah.
I just have a question, like why do we use the question marks instead of just putting in the values?
I was afraid
that-
someone would ask me that.
Sorry.
It's okay. Because I remembered learning it at some point, but then I couldn't find it. Sorry.
In the reading, it was talking about preventing SQL injection, so I'm guessing that's like a security thing.
Yes.
But other than that, is it to like just prevent code smell or?
As far as I know, it's for preventing SQL injection. So letting
Okay.
someone kind of insert whatever malicious SQL they could. Like I think Vlad shared the cartoon that comes up about this, where like it's like the student who he enters like some kind of SQL for like dropping like all of the grades data at the school. The cartoon is a lot funnier than I am, clearly, but like that's the gist of it. But so yeah, my sense is that it is to help with SQL injection, but then I confuse myself because later in the labs it says like don't do this because it poses a security issue with SQL injection. So I kind of set myself in a loop and confused myself. But my best sense is that it's related to security.
You also want to be flexible.
Well, fair
Yeah.
enough, right? It's more dynamic.
And about the question marks, they say that you can do a check if there's a semicolon in the data.
Fair enough. And that's actually like, thanks for that, Sarah, and also John. Like, it's just more flexible, right? Because you don't have to specify like you're using that one thing in time. It's a little more dynamic. Okay, that makes sense to me. Okay, so we have our code for updating tweets. We need to actually check and see if it does the thing. So if we exit our program, we hop back into our pry. I'm gonna try to pick, I guess something simple. What's like a whack Twitter message?
The Earth is flat.
I appreciate you. Oh no, why won't it let me do that? Well, now we can update it to say the Earth is flat, since I don't know how to fix this error that we run into. But if we grab our very last tweet that we just made, so I'm going to store that in a variable, tweet.all.last, right? I guess it doesn't get those funky characters at the end, but we've got it here, right? We've got our last tweet. I can update the message, so I can say take that last tweet and set its message to the Earth is round, earth shattering. The Earth is round, right? Now, one thing here that can be confusing, right? Have I actually altered anything in my database here? Have I updated anything I'm storing on my table?
No.
Not yet.
No. I've updated that object. If I look at it now, like it's got an updated message, but that's different than persisting, right? So the object is not one and the same with what's in my table. We connect them together, we map them together. So now if I go ahead and I save that tweet, right, that just returns an empty array. But if I look at all of my tweets, right, if I scroll to the very last one, right, it's been updated, right? So that has persisted. It should be, I got to reload my database, right? So now, probably should have changed the name too, but we get that updated message that the Earth is round, right? So again, like just updating the object itself does not update the DB. You still have to make that database call, which is what our actual save method does. Right. Cool. Any questions on that piece? Heard a breath.
No,
like there-
not on this.
Okay. But
No,
maybe-
because when you were looking for the tweet, couldn't you just do a tweet dot last instead of tweeted all last?
Oh, yeah, I could do that based on sometimes I forget where I am. That's true, right? Because I have it here, so I could have just done tweets.last.
No,
You're
but
right.
can you also don't do it tweet dot last?
Okay, so you're saying if I do tweets.last, whoop, except you
no,
spell
just
it right?
No, it's tweet.
Just, oh, because I have it in the variable. Yeah. So then if that's here, that's a good question. Okay, I think I see what you're getting at. So if we did do that, this is kind of like, this was our last database call, right?
Mhm.
Before we actually called message. So when we look there, actually, that tweet hasn't been updated, right? Because it's like, that's when we called all before updating our tweet. Then we called save on it, which actually did update it. And then I did tweet.all. So let me illustrate that again, actually. So I think I could just do here. So if I just look at my tweets.last, right? So that hasn't been updated, right? But then if I look in my actual database, like I'm making a new database call, that one has. So that's a little bit confusing, but it's kind of like, because we're capturing this moment in time, right? If I've done any updates, it's not affecting that variable. It's affecting any subsequent database calls I would make.
Yeah, but I mean also you do capital T tweet dot all of the last. Can you not do just do tweet dot last? So keep the leave the all away.
So, well, tweet.last, I think would error.
With the capital.
Tweet.
Capital T.
Capital T.
Hmm.
Right? Because the tweet, that's our class, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That might be something that Active Record gives us that maybe we have later, but we don't have out of the box. But yeah, that's the class itself, which doesn't have, it's an array method.
Yeah, okay. No, because in my program it did.
Fair enough.
That's probably Active Record.
Gotcha. Good question though. Okay. Okay. So what if I wanted to delete a tweet? Right? I can save a tweet or update a tweet. I can get all my tweets. But if I wanted to actually remove a tweet, I can make an instance method. I can start it off in the same way as I have been, right?
Drop
so
table. I'm just kidding. I'm sorry.
I'm easily distracted, Abdul. Like I'm like a goldfish. I'm gonna forget my whole train of thought. I have to connect to my database, right? I'm gonna do that in the same way that we have. I'm gonna execute some SQL, right? And here, I think I can just do it here. It's a pretty short SQL string. I can do what? I can delete from, right? The name of my table hasn't changed, tweets. But then how do I know which tweet to delete?
Where
Self.id again.
Yeah, so we're not going to put in the actual ID value just yet. We can say, hey, where our ID is equal to some value I'll provide in the future, right? And then I can pass that next, right? So I'm passing my SQL first, and then any values that I want added inside. So there I would use self ID, right? And that should, in theory, let me go into my database, find the row whose ID matches that value of this current tweet, right? Because this is an instance method, right? I can call it on the current tweet object, right? And then find that matching tweet. And then now, if I exit, run back in here. Oh no, whatever that is. But if I grab my very last tweet, I want to store it in a variable. Last, right? So that's my last tweet. And then if I want to delete it, last dot delete, I get back nothing. But if I access all of my tweets, okay, and I scroll way down, okay, I don't have that last delete me tweet anymore. I have the Earth is round one, right? So that should be gone. And then if I pop into my database, yeah, I think it was that number 13. 12 should be here, right? So not too bad. We can delete existing tweets. Right. Cool. I think that we have, I think one more thing that I want to show you guys, and then we can wrap, is that we can make class finders too. There are a bunch of them that we have available to us in Active Record. We can find on any attribute on our object essentially, but the ID is just the most common pattern of doing that. So what I'm gonna build here is a class finder, right? It's a class method because my class is in charge of all, like an individual instance is not in charge of finding itself. That's something the class is responsible for. So I can make a method called something like find by ID. I'm going to start off in the same way where I connect to my database. I'm going to call that execute method again. Right? I'm going to pass it some SQL and then anything else I might need. Okay, but I'm going to define that SQL string here. So then, this one is actually fairly simple. I just want to say something like, give me all the information for this tweet that has the ID that I'm looking for. Okay. So where do I start there? Once I have a string.
Select.
Select. Okay.
Star.
Star. We're going to send to the patterns from tweets.
Tweets.
Cool.
Where
Where?
ID is question mark.
Cool. Right. But then we kind of run into an issue. We have the right pattern here. Thanks for that, John. But then, like, where does the actual value for the ID come from?
The input.
I know what you mean, but like, how do I incorporate that into my method?
Is the brackets by itself dot find by ID?
Yeah, so I need an argument, right? Because this is a class method. I can't leverage the current instance. I can't leverage self in the same way I did in these instance methods, right? Because self is just going to get me the class, and my class itself doesn't know anything about an individual ID, right? So this is actually good because I've talked to a couple of your cohort mates about this. For those of you who haven't assessed yet, sometimes this is a thing they might ask you to like refactor. Like when you pull some code from one method into another, right? You might have to have that method take an input, right? Because how else are you going to get access to the data that you need, right? So if I don't have anything I can access within my method, say with self or an instance variable or something of that nature, like there's no other way for my method to know about it than for me to pass it as an input, right? So I can call this method with a value of ID as the input, and then whatever that variable is, right? I'm just going to reference it here as well, right? So it's just something that I would have to specify when I want to find it. Like, tell me what ID I want to find, right? But then if I exit here and come back, I need enough, right? But now if well, first off, let me look at all of my tweets. Tweet.all. If I look at this last one, right? So it's got an ID of 13, right? I don't have to find that one. I can find any of them, but it's a class method. So I call it on the class, find by ID, and then tell it whatever you want, like which ID you want. So I could give it 13. It's going to find that last one. I could specify, find me the very first one, right? And that's going to work just fine. So I think one last thing we need to do there. We can find our hash here, but then two issues that come up here. Like, what data type am I returning?
Array.
It's an array. Do I want an array?
Nope.
No. Do I even want a hash? Like, I got to get to this hash first of all, right? So I'm going to need something like a dot first, because it's only going to find one thing with that ID, because IDs are unique. So I could do something like this and at least get at that hash. I'm going to go ahead and add that here. But then ultimately, if I'm pulling data from my database, it's going to come back as an array of a hash in this case. I can get the actual hash, but I probably want to be working with actual objects, right? It comes back from my table one way, but then just like we can take an object and insert data about it into our database, we can pull data from our database and map it into objects, right? So all I need to do is tell my program here, like, hey, once you found like the data for that tweet, make me a tweet object, right? So that I can then use that wherever I need it in my program, right? So this again returns a hash, right? That's convenient for me because my initialize knows how to take a hash and make a new tweet. So one thing I can do is I can just say, hey, tweet class, go ahead and make me a new tweet using that hash data that I could call something like result. So then if I go ahead and do the same, just gonna make a silly one here. And then let's say I want to find the very first item in my database, right? Now I get it back as an object, right? I see frowny faces. I would love to take questions. I was losing you guys somewhere between save and delete, but then like a bunch of you perked up here. How are we feeling about this? Right. We can write our SQL to find the tweet that we want, right? We can specify the ID. We execute that SQL. That's going to return an ugly array for us. It's got a hash in it because we specified that here, right? Give me my results for my rows as hashes. So we get that back. In this case, as an array with one hash, so we just grab the one thing we wanted. We could have just as easily have done bracket 0. It doesn't matter. It's only ever going to have one thing because IDs are unique. So it's only going to find one thing with that ID, right? And then we're making a new tweet based on that result. Now, I think the one thing I want to end on before I just kind of wrap, should I be...
It doesn't stumble over the ID. It's not present when you normally make a new tweet. I didn't see your initialize from the tweet because you pass in the. Okay, you have an ID. Okay.
Yeah. So one thing I have, it's kind of a trick question. It's not a thing. I just want to make sure you guys are clear that it's not a thing. Should I be worried about making duplicate objects with this code? Should I be worried about making a new tweet based on this data? Abdul is very emphatically knowing me. So then why is it no?
Because every tweet's going to have a new object ID.
Okay, so that is true. But like, does .new inherently save anything to my database anyway?
Nope.
No, right? So all I'm doing, like, we're at a point now where the database is your keeper of all truth. In mod 1, it was your model. Now it's your database. So like when I pull something from the database, it's going to have an ID. Cool, but it's also just a hash. So I'm just making a new tweet object to represent it, and then I can use it in my program however I want, but I'm not re-saving it to the database or anything like that. It's going to be a new tweet that does know how to handle having an ID. So it's not making a duplicate, it's just taking the data from my table and making a new tweet object for me to work with, right? But it's not saving there. So there's no issues with duplicates in that code. Cool. Right, so to sum things up, ORMs are amazing. Active Record is the one we'll be using. It's going to write all of this code for us. It's going to teach your projects how to persist data. So from now on, all of your projects will have a database. I didn't really explicitly make this point, but it might have made itself. Like every time I spun this up, it knew about the objects I already had. I wasn't starting from a clean slate every single time. If I wanted to do that, I'd have to like drop my tables and start fresh, which generally you don't want to do, right? But now your data will persist, and that's super powerful. And pretty soon, like you guys are gonna have super clean models. All this stuff is gonna go away. Just by like doing very, very simple code, right? Everything gets built for us by Active Record. It doesn't mean we can't customize things. You can still build logic in your models, but a lot of this stuff that you can like do in your sleep at this point, Active Record is gonna do all that good stuff for us. Okay. Which I think is amazing and exciting, and Active Record's not going away. You're gonna be using it all throughout Sinatra and Rails, and even in your final projects, you'll have Rails backends. So pretty much from here on out, Active Record is going to be a presence in what we do in this program. So get excited. or pretend to be excited because it's going to be here. All right. And any questions, concerns, bad jokes before we wrap up? Anything I can clear up before you guys go off and enjoy the nice weather for those of you who can? Did everybody feel like they learned a little something today? Cool. Maybe. All right. All right. Well, then I'm going to kick everybody except Sarah out because I'm going to chat with Sarah a bit. So you guys can go eat dinner or take a nap or build an ORM from scratch, whatever makes you happy and brings you joy. Right? You guys have a great night.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Have a good one. Bye.
You too. All right. Everybody have a great night. I'm going to stop recording. Yes.